Welcome to episode 6 of the A Storm of Swords rereads, and we will be covering Davos 1 in today's episode. This is a really, not exactly fun, but it's a really intriguing, almost character study for Davos. A lot of our time that we spent in Davos's 3 chapters in A Clash of Kings were more spent on, I would say, Stannis as a character overall. This chapter to me does a really nice job of, 1, concluding what happened during the Battle of the Blackwater, while also being a really good introduction into Davos and him trying to survive. There's a lot of vibes that I got from this chapter that I think that George was kind of inspired by. In a lot of ways, this is a very simple chapter. Davos has been stranded on this, not even an island, but kind of like this jutting rock at the Blackwater Bay. He's been trying to survive by any means that he can, but he's considering his life and how much further does he want to go on. But also even further, he has survivor's guilt. Why did he live while all of his sons died, or all of these noble lords or knights? Why was it that he survived, at least till this point? I think George probably took a lot of inspiration from hearing survivors' stories, from whether being stranded in the ocean or having survivor's guilt from, traumatic events like, say, war, or something that came to mind for me was 9/11 and hearing survivors talk about their experiences. A lot of the same themes are very present. And so I found this to be a chapter that, yes, kind of falls into the same things I've talked about with some of the other introduction chapters for this story, especially with book 1 and 2, where they all kind of follow the same pattern of just being a very general introduction, not covering too much plot or story for the first chapter. And Davos is very similar to that, but I do think this chapter is slightly better than, say, maybe Arya's or Catelyn's, because it deals with some really awesome themes. But before we dive into the chapter fully, if you do enjoy these rereads, feel free to subscribe, like, so you don't miss any of these episodes, as they will drop every single Tuesday at 7 p.m. U.S. Central Time. And let's dive into page 54. Davos sees a ship in the distance while stranded on a small rocky island after the Battle of the Blackwater. He considers whether he wants to be rescued or simply let himself die. He is suffering from a severe fever that has left him extremely weak and has caused him persistent diarrhea. Each day he grows weaker and believes he may not survive much longer. Right now with Davos, and I think it's really interesting the way that George paints this chapter, where in reality, we're right at where Davos is going to be rescued. There isn't much time that occurs in this chapter. It very much spans like a couple moments. But what George does is he kind of takes us back. What has Davos experienced? And it's Davos, even as he's thinking about hailing this ship, everything that he's experienced and should he continue living or not. I think that's really interesting because we have this whole arc in this chapter of him surviving and what that's cost him. As we see him dealing with hunger and dehydration and illnesses, especially with the cold, Davos is struggling to keep going. His only source of fresh water comes from rainwater collecting in pools, cracks, and hollows in the rocks, and several days earlier, all of his water sources had dried up. He had been on the edge of thinking he's either going to die of dehydration or he's going to drink seawater, and that will be when he dies. But thankfully for us and for Davos, he was able to survive because of the rain. Desperate from thirst, he nearly drank seawater despite knowing it would likely kill him, as a rainstorm arrived before he did so, allowing him to drink and refill the island's water pools. Something that I think is so interesting is that even Davos, someone that is a seaman, he knows a lot about don't drink the salt water, even in desperation, this time where you're just so thirsty you can't even swallow, you can't talk. Even he was persuaded to maybe drink this seawater. He was so weak at the time that he could do little more than lie in the rain with his mouth open. As the rain temporarily restored his strength and replenished his water supply, most of that water has now been used up or evaporated. So he's kind of in the same situation in the current time of picking up on this chapter, that Davos is slowly running out of water again. Davos expects by the next day he will once again be reduced to drinking muddy water from the bottoms of the rock pools. And another thing that George does a really good job painting here is the human body can survive without food for much longer than it can survive without water. And I was listening to a story last night as I was trying to sleep because I've been having a lot of back problems and I couldn't fall asleep. And I came upon this story where the people survived basically by drinking sea turtles' blood, because that can kind of substitute apparently as food. It's kind of wild how like low nutrition you can have, but having access to water you can survive for. Like they survive for like 6 weeks in the open ocean with that stuff. It's crazy. It kind of reminds me a lot of this chapter with Davos, where he doesn't have much to eat, but he is being able to at least get water, and that's the key. As we get into page 55, Davos knows that if thirst and fever do not kill him, then starvation likely will. His island is a barren rock rising from Blackwater Bay with almost no food available. At low tide, a narrow, stony strand appears where he occasionally finds tiny crabs. So like I mentioned, he's barely surviving off of some of these crabs as he catches them, smashes them on the rock, and eats the meat and contents of their shells. It's not the best food in the world, but it'll keep you alive. The problem is, what if you run into a couple days where you can't find any of these crabs? What if it doesn't rain for a week? Then you're screwed. Because at least in, say, some of these other stranded situations that I've heard of before, they had stuff that they could catch the rain. Here, Davos has nothing. I mean, he's basically using the natural rocks to try and, like, have these pools of water. That's all Davos has. So his situation is extremely dire. Davos notes when the tide comes in, the strand disappears, and Davos must climb higher to avoid being swept back into the sea. His shelter is a small hollow beneath a rock overhang that provides little protection from the weather. Think about this if you're Davos. There's no real safety. Even if you're trying to sleep at night or you're trying to just get some rest, you have to worry that, oh, the tide's going to come in enough that it will sweep me away. It's a horrifying thing because also if you're Davos, you're never really dry. Even if the water isn't sweeping you away, it's still crashing against these rocks and splashing up on you. It's a horrible feeling that Davos must have, especially at night when it's cold and you're wet. It's a terrible feeling. I mean, think about some of the other stories that we know from history, like the Titanic. I mean, just some horrifying things that those people had to endure. It's kind of similar here with Davos. Now, the water would have been much colder in the situation of the Titanic, but still, that generally applies to this situation with Davos as well. Davos notes that basically nothing grows on the island except seabirds rarely landing there, and though gulls sometimes perch on the highest rocks, Davos isn't really able to do anything about that. He's not able to have the strength to actually throw rocks at them, to kill them, or stun them, knock them down. It's basically like they're just taunting him. There's available food there, but Davos isn't strong enough to actually kill them. From Davos' island, he can see large rocky spires nearby where many gulls nest. He considers swimming to one of the rocks to raid the nests for eggs or birds, but Davos decides against it because the water is cold, the currents are strong, and he lacks the strength for the swim. If Davos was like well fed at this point and he wasn't having sicknesses, he might actually be able to do this, but at this point, you can't. And another thing Davos is going to bring up in this chapter, just think about it from the perspective of if you're a trading galley, why would you ever come anywhere near where Davos is? There's all these obstacles that could easily sink your ship and result in lots of death. So that's another thing Davos is realizing as well, especially because he's gone where he is before. He's gone in these areas where he's had to avoid detection, smuggling, and he's had to do some dangerous routes like where this is. So he knows the normal vessel likely is not going to come by where he is. But as the weather grows colder as autumn progresses, especially at night, strong winds and rough seas frequently leave him soaked and shivering. He suffers alternating bouts of fever and chills. I actually had COVID for the first time this year, and it is absolutely hell. You basically, what Davos just described is what you have, at least I did anyway, where it's like, oh, you're in bed, you're underneath all the covers, you're sweating, you're super hot, you have a fever. You take the covers off, now you have the chills. So it is hell, and to imagine what Davos is going through while also dealing with starvation and dehydration is crazy. He also developed a persistent cough as driftwood and charred debris occasionally wash ashore during low tide, but for Davos, this doesn't mean anything. He has no way of starting a fire, and all this wood is going to be wet, and even if he was to store it where like he's resting at, like this little hollow, the water still gets there. He would never have dried wood. So, again, the debris doesn't really help him. The best he could maybe do with it would be like trying to gather enough that maybe he could try and float adrift with this debris if he had enough of it, but it's just not enough, especially with Davos being so weak that he wouldn't be able to even like craft a makeshift like raft or something. Davos then had once tried rubbing pieces of the driftwood together to create a fire, but only succeeded in blistering his hands. His clothing remains wet, and he has lost one of his boots since the battle. Davos thinks about how his existence is just painful. Over and over again, it's either thirst, hunger, exposure. One of them is going to kill him at some point, and he knows this. As we get into page 56, Davos had considered simply walking into the sea and swimming towards the distant shore to the north, knowing he is too weak to survive the journey. It's better in Davos's mind to, at the very least, die trying escaping or actually making it. At this point, Davos is kind of going through this like daily torture, and there's no end in sight. And so he wants to do something rather than just sit by and just hope that something happens. And I think a lot of people would relate in a situation with Davos is in. Davos thinks as a sailor, dying at sea would be a fitting end, but while on the island, he spots a sail on the horizon that gradually grows larger. Davos recognizes that his island is one of the dangerous rocky seamounts on Blackwater Bay, known to sailors as the Spears of the Merling King. These rocks are notorious hazards because many more lie hidden beneath the water's surface. And that's another thing, going back to the Titanic, you couldn't even really see the glacier that they hit, really, because it was just, a lot of it was underneath the actual ocean, and there's a lot more to it in terms of their actual ability to view things. And there's other like weather conditions that prevented them from seeing as well. It kind of reminds me of that, where it's like, you know, on the surface, like, yeah, avoid Davos's little rock thing, but there's also going to be more that are just below the surface of the water that you wouldn't see that would still do huge damage. It just reinforces the hopelessness Davos feels. He knows regularly no ship would ever come this way. The approaching ship appears to be heading close enough to pass within hailing distance of his island. Davos still remains uncertain whether he even wants to be rescued. He thinks about the sons he believes he has lost in the Battle of the Blackwater: Dale, Allard, Merrick, Mathos, and possibly Devon. Devon does survive, but the rest of these sons all die. And so the hopelessness that Davos feels, the survivor's guilt, especially because Davos led his sons into this. Now, his sons made their own choices to also back Stannis, but in a lot of ways, he feels responsible for their deaths. And so for Davos, he's got to be feeling, why do I survive? What is my purpose? Why have I been left to live while so many others have died that are younger, that had more life left of them? And I think this is natural of any horrible thing we see in today's world. Again, I'll go back to 9/11. I've seen multiple accounts from people that they tragically think about, oh, they could have saved this person, or why is it that I survived while so many others died? It reminds me so much of that. And I think that's the beauty of some of the writing here from George, is it's so realistic to how people would react in a situation like Davos is in. He's not even sure if he wants to be picked up by this ship. He doesn't know if he even wants to continue with his life. And that is, to me, very fascinating, because it could have been a simple chapter where Davos tells us what happened and then he hails the ship. But George finds a way to make it way more interesting than just that simple premise. Davos recalls sailing into battle beneath the fiery heart banner of Stannis Baratheon and the Lord of Light. His ship, Black Betha, was part of the second line of the fleet. His sons served on different ships in the fleet, with Merrick aboard Fury and Mathos serving beside Davos on Black Betha. Davos remembers the battle beginning with fighting between Stannis' fleet and Joffrey's fleet beneath the walls of King's Landing. But the battle changed suddenly when wildfire ignited on the river. Davos recalls Black Betha seeming to lift from the water as the wildfire explosion engulfed the fleet. He was thrown into the river and carried by the current. He witnesses enormous green flames consuming ships across the Blackwater. He saw Black Betha burning along with Fury and many other vessels, burning men jumping into the water as ships were destroyed around him. He lost sight of Wraith and Lady Maria during the chaos. As he was swept downstream, Davos saw that the Lannisters had stretched a massive iron chain across the mouth of the river. The river exit was blocked by burning ships, wildfire in the chain, trapping Stannis' fleet. All of this we know from Davos' last chapter. I think this is kind of the stuff that George runs into, where it's, just telling you, the audience, what happened in the last book, especially when these books were releasing. It had been 2 years roughly since A Clash of Kings release, so just allowing the viewer to remember what exactly happened and how Davos got into the situation. But this is the part where it gets more interesting, because in that chapter, we know roughly what happened to Davos. The chapter ends when he gets into the water and he realizes that the chain is up. So this is the new part of that story, adding to the context. It's similar to Jaime's first chapter, where with Jaime, we don't know what actually happened after Catelyn's last chapter, and his chapter serves to fill in those gaps. Kind of similar to what this chapter is doing as we get into page 57. Davos recalls seeing the wildfire inferno at the mouth of the Blackwater and hearing the sounds of burning ships, steam, and dying men as the current carried him toward it. He remembers that he could have done nothing and allowed himself to die alongside the rest of Stannis' fleet, but instead he took a deep breath and dove beneath the water, hoping to swim under the chain, burning ships, and floating wildfire. That's all Davos could really do, and the thing that saves him is he was not wearing steel, he was not wearing plate, so in this situation he was able to swim relatively normally. And for Davos, there's only one way you live here, because either one's going to be you're going to be captured by the Lannisters, which might not be terrible, but given Davos's position, he might actually be executed. And the other thing being, well, if he doesn't do that, he's going to have to swim under this chain. He's going to have to swim under the carnage of bodies everywhere, wildfire, and the ships. And again, another problem when you think about any major naval sinking is the ship's weight falling on you as you're in the water. And then obviously you're going to drown. You can't get back up to get oxygen. So that's everything that Davos is thinking about right now. And that is horrifying to really think about from Davos's point of view. As he swam underwater, he saw other soldiers drowning after being dragged down by the weight of their armor. It's interesting that Season 7 did not do this and kind of forgot about this whole concept that Season 2 / A Clash of Kings / A Storm of Swords set up. Just a random jab there at Season 7, but it is relevant because it is very realistic. Davos continued swimming deeper while holding his breath and allowing his current to carry him. He eventually lost his sense of direction beneath the water and could no longer tell up from down. As panic set in, he struggled to find the surface. Think about this from Davos' point of view. So you're trying to hold your breath, and you're trying to go as low as possible. Like you're trying to find the bottom of the bay so that you're going to avoid any of the carnage coming down, avoid the chain, the wildfire, and you're going to try to go underneath and come out at a precise point in which you avoid the chain, the wildfire, and any of the ship carnage. Think about that for a second. And the fear, because you know if you don't go far enough, you will die. But at the same time, if you go for too long and too far, you'll drown. The odds of Davos surviving this are not good. And the other part of this being that Davos mentions, which I think is still very realistic, is the idea of once you actually are underneath the ocean, and especially when this is a nighttime battle, and the amount of darkness that would have been in the ocean, you can't even tell up from down. So theoretically, you might be trying to swim up, but in reality, you're swimming back down towards the bottom. It is horrifying. One of my biggest fears is drowning, and I used to have nightmares when I was younger about something like this. Yeah, I think just a really bad situation Davos finds himself that really adds to the Battle of the Blackwater and why it's so amazing. But as Davos is trying to get back to the surface, his lungs gave out and he swallowed water, believing he was drowning. The next thing he remembers is waking on a rocky strand beneath a stone spire surrounded by the Blackwater Bay. Beside him were a broken mast, a burned sail, and a corpse. The next high tide carried the debris and the body away, leaving Davos alone on the island. In a lot of ways, the sea is just swallowing up all of Davos's regret and guilt. It's leaving him on this island to think about his actions. It's almost like if you're, say, a criminal and you get put in, solitary confinement. It's kind of what Davos is in right now. He's battling with his own demons, that choices that have led him to this moment. And it's so interesting because Davos probably should have died here. He's drowning. He goes completely unconscious in the ocean. But somehow he finds his way and lives. Whether this was divine intervention, maybe the Lord was looking out for Davos after, the fires killed all of his sons. Maybe this was just some punishment or torment. Maybe if there's some other god in play here, maybe the drowned god saved Davos. Who knows? Or maybe this was just Davos got lucky. Either way, It is crazy to think about the possibilities. But Davos notes he is familiar with the area from his years as a smuggler because it was a place honest sailors avoided. Davos had occasionally used the area during his smuggling days to remain hidden from others. Another thing I want to point out is Davos calls these rocks the spears of the Merling King. So I wonder how those got their name. And two, were there mermen, mermaids? Were those in Blackwater Bay at some point? I do wonder, because George likes to play around with that. We have more than just this in terms of references to them, but something to ponder. As we get into page 58, Davos thinks that if anyone ever finds his body, the small rock might be named after him as his only real legacy. He reflects on the death of his sons and blames himself for leading them into battle of the Blackwater. He thinks the futures they will never have. Dale will never have children with his wife. Allard will never return to the woman he left behind. Mathos will never captain his own ship, and Merrick will never become a knight. Davos questions why he should continue living when so many better and nobler men have died. And that, to me, is such a gut punch. That's such a heavy theme of people who have experienced especially trauma or have seen other people around them die, and they think that they are somehow guilty for some of those things. This is some beautiful writing for the character of Davos, and it really touches on some things that I think are very relevant today, especially with the horrors that happen in the world. Yeah, I think one thing that I think that this chapter is just so beautifully written, especially from the point of view of Davos and him as a character. He repeatedly tells himself to hide in his cave, let the approaching ship pass, and allow himself to die. And the other thing is, this is not going to be a clean death, like it's not going to be painless. He's literally being basically tortured by the things around him every single day. That's how bad he views himself at this point, that he should just hide away and die. As the ship draws nearer, he realizes that soon it will pass beyond sight if he does nothing. He instinctively reaches for the leather pouch he always wore around his neck, as he realizes the pouch containing his finger bones is no longer with him. It has maybe been washed away. Now, there's some other theories here that maybe Melisandre stole his finger bones. I think there's some problems with how was that actually executed? Were they swapped out at some point? Because some people believe Melisandre might glamour into Davos because there's a very explicit note of finger bones being used to glamour people all the way into book 5. This is something we'll revisit in this reread years from now, but I did want to bring that up here as well. But it also tells us that Davos' story is going to change. The man that he is, he's going to become very different going forward. He's going to be motivated by, at least at this early point of the story, killing Melisandre, because he's going to blame her for everything that's gone wrong. Believing he has lost both his luck and his sons in the wildfire, he begins to pray to the Mother for mercy. While weeping, he hears what seems to be a faint voice accusing him of bringing the fire. Davos denies responsibility, instead blames Melisandre. This is very interesting because the voice that Davos is hearing, is this him just seeing stuff? He's extremely malnourished, he's sick. Or is this genuinely some sort of thing he's hearing in his head? Is this some sort of magic? Is this divine intervention? You do see this a lot with survivor stories, as they all seem to have this moment, maybe not like what Davos is explaining, where he's saying okay, somebody was talking to him, but they all seem to have that moment of divine intervention or that turning point of their survival. I think for Davos, it's maybe more to do with just him mentally and where he's at and the guilt that he feels, and he's applying that to this voice he's hearing. But another thing I really want to point out is something I love about the Battle of Blackwater specifically, and Davos as a character, is this is a battle that took everything from Davos. He's lost most of his family. He's lost his luck. He's a completely changed individual. He's about to maybe die at this point as well. Now, I want you guys to compare why I dislike, for instance, the Battle of the Bastards. Compare Davos here and what he suffers from this battle versus the consequences that any of our main characters in that battle face. I like kind of showing why, I have certain opinions, but let's move on, as that's not exactly relevant to this chapter. Davos recalls Melisandre's arrival from Asshai and her growing influence over Stannis, Queen Selyse, and the court on Dragonstone. He remembers Stannis adopting the fiery heart of R'hllor on his banners, as Davos recalls Melisandre encouraging Stannis to burn the statues of the Seven at Dragonstone. He also remembers the deconstruction of the Godswood at Storm's End, including the burning of the ancient Weirwood heart tree. As we get into page 59, Davos continues blaming Melisandre for the destruction and death associated with Stannis' cause, but also acknowledges his own role in supporting her. And I do think that Davos is kind of looking for someone to blame. Like, for instance, Davos losing his sons is not exactly Melisandre's fault, but he is looking for someone to blame. And Melisandre has been this person that obviously seems evil. Crescent died because of her. She's spawning these shadow babies. She can be definitely viewed as like this evil entity, especially the way Davos can view her. But let's be fair here. The wildfire had nothing to do with Melisandre. That had everything to do with Tyrion and his planning. But at this point, Davos has no access to Tyrion. So it's, I think, in a lot of ways, Davos projecting that. But he's also seeing the bad influence Melisandre has done to Stannis. Stannis killed his own brother, and we know why. We talked all about that in A Clash of Kings. Go back to that reread if you want to hear more about that. But there's a lot of reasons why Davos especially is blaming Melisandre. Davos remembers secretly rowing Melisandre beneath Storm's End so he could give birth to the shadow assassin that killed Sir Courtney Penrose. He reflects on how he stood by while Melisandre's influence over Stannis grew. Davos recalls the burning of the statues of the Seven at Dragonstone and admits he did nothing to oppose it. He remembers the death of Maester Crescent and again acknowledges that he remained silent. And as the ship approaches, Davos realizes it will soon pass beyond him if he does nothing. Davos must decide, will he act, will he survive, and if he does, who is he going to be afterwards? I also do love the way that George writes Davos in a way that Davos is not just blaming Melisandre for everything. He has been somebody that's been complicit in allowing Melisandre to grow in her influence. And that is now, he's having a little bit of blame on himself, survivor's guilt. I think that's really compelling writing here as well. Davos decides he must survive. He begins climbing to the top of the rock despite his weaknesses, fever, and injuries. His shortened fingers slip several times on the damp stone, nearly causing him to fall. Reaching the top, he crouches and waves his arms while shouting for help. From his higher position, he can make out details of the approaching vessel, including its striped hull, bronze figurehead, and sail. A sailor then spots him and points out to the rest of the crew as the ship lowers its sails, deploys its oars, and turns toward the rock. Because the vessel cannot safely approach the rocks, a small boat is launched with 5 men aboard. The boat reaches the island and one of the men calls out asking Davos who he is. And this is a big moment because Davos doesn't necessarily know who these men are. And Davos also knows that likely Stannis lost the Battle of the Blackwater. So a ship being right next to where King's Landing is, the Blackwater Bay, the odds are this could be Joffrey's fleet. These could be Joffrey's men. So Davos has to play this correctly. He has to be clever. He has to identify, based on this ship, based on the people that are coming to get me, who are these people? Davos struggles to answer the question because of his weakened condition and dry throat, but he identifies himself as a participant of the battle, saying that he was a captain and a knight. But this doesn't help the men decide who he necessarily is, because if he chooses wrong, if he was on one side or the other, Davos might be killed here or even left to die. As we get into page 60, the men in the rescue boat ask Davos which king he serves, making him briefly fear they might be loyal to Joffrey. But this is what's so great about Davos, is similar to what we saw with Brienne, for instance, in her chapter with Jaime. He realizes the ship is Lysine and recognizes it as one of Salador San's vessels. He interprets the ship's arrival as a sign that he has been spared for a purpose. The question is, what is that purpose? A lot of people, especially that live these things, believe they need to do something with their life. They didn't just survive for no reason. And so a lot of people will tell their story, bring awareness to whatever happened, whether it's a shooting that happened, or whether it was surviving some sort of event, or it was surviving, like we've talked about a lot in this chapter specifically, being stranded at sea, maybe the lessons they learned, maybe sex trafficking and someone surviving that. That is what a lot of people go as their purpose. With Davos, it's a bit different. Davos is going to believe it's almost getting revenge, tries to justify it as he's trying to free Stannis of Melisandre's influence. Davos remembers that Stannis is still alive and still has his family remaining, including his wife and surviving sons. He thinks of the mother's mercy and believes he has been given one more chance. Davos shouts that he serves King Stannis Baratheon. The man in the boat replies that they serve Stannis as well. And the chapter ends there with Davos being found and rescued. And this is a chapter where not a lot happens, right? We see a couple minutes pass by in real time. Davos is mainly in his head the entire chapter, recounting the events basically that have led us here. It's kind of similar to Ned's last chapter in Game of Thrones, where nothing really happens when you think about it, outside of he gets visited by Varys, but it's him contemplating on his life and the idea that he may die soon. It's very similar to that, and I think in that regard it works really well for this chapter. So I would say another fairly strong chapter. I don't think it's the best chapter of all time, but I'd say given opening chapters and the way they usually go with George's writing, a very strong one overall. So that is episode 6 of the reread. I hope you guys all enjoyed. Again, stay tuned for next week's upload, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.